just after noon and we're already SRO. So it's a good sign.
See, Tom, you didn't scare them away.
We'll see after. For those of you not familiar with the series, this is the regular Monday noon series. And we're already pretty full for the fall. We might even send out a whole list soon once we get that clear. Let me just briefly, before we begin, say that next week, as you know, we will be having a terrific speaker. So you all want to be sure and show up next week.
Yes.
But the week after, we will be back in session. The speaker then will be Pablo Laskowski from Northwestern, who has just published a book. And actually, he'll be talking more about his next project, but including the one that just came out. And his talk is titled, When Supply and Demand Do Not Meet, the Divergent Online News Preferences of Journalists and Consumers and What They Mean for the Future of Media and Democracy. His new book is called Digitizing the News, which just came out from MIT Press. Today's speaker falls into the needs no introduction category, and I am aware because he's already told me that he wants every last minute of the time, so I'll try and keep this short. I think the only thing maybe I'll tell you that some of you don't know is that this would be your either 30th or 31st year. 31st year at USC, so he knows his way around.
I started when I was 9. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Today I want to talk about Obama and the healthcare debate, which I think is the most significant legislative achievement of the first year of the Obama presidency, and one that came at a great cost, blood, sweat, and tears, I think. And I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of dialogic argument, the concept I'm going to explain a bit more. My goal is to get through this and finish it up with ample time for you to have a chance and have your opportunity to ask questions or give a rebuttal or talk. Whenever the topic is politics, I understand that people don't want to listen. They want to share their own opinion, and I will be respectful of that. First of all, what this study did is analyze the public arguments during the debate over health care reform. The arguments that were primarily made not necessarily in Congress itself or in committee hearings, but instead the arguments that were being made on news reports and primarily directly to the public in public speeches. In this talk, I'm going to discuss Obama's campaign message and the implications of that message for setting up the framework for the debate. Because I think it was Obama and Obama's proclaimed messages from the campaign that the Republicans were very much focused on responding to. Second, I'll talk a bit about the concept of dialogic deliberative argument and its role. Third, I'm going to focus on arguments used by the administration and the Republican leadership in the House and Senate. Certainly other lobbying groups, physicians group, insurance groups, other interest groups participated in this debate. And I also looked at some of that discourse, but it's not a part of what I'm going to talk about today. And finally, I'm going to talk about the consequences for the political sphere of how this debate took place. On Obama's message, I think I can truncate this slide and make it very quick. The essence of what Obama ran on was hope. And hope was a message designed to appeal to people who were really feeling hopeless after the Bush presidency. And that's not a partisan statement. Depending on how you parse the statistics, George W. Bush was polling with some of the very worst numbers in the history of modern polling. So people were very frustrated. This was not considered a presidency that was effective by any measure. If you want to see some outstanding data on that, in a book that just came out, I'd refer you to the Obama Victory, which is by Kinski, Hardy, and Jameson. And they look at the Annenberg electoral studies and make that argument very eloquently right in the introduction. The second part of this message, though, about hope, was that it was hope that new leadership could reinvigorate government, and reinvigorate government in a fundamental way that would produce change. And change became the most repeated message of the Obama campaign. What's interesting as you think about this notion of change is that it wasn't just change in policy, it was change in the very practice of politics itself. And this was a message that Obama kept returning to. He was going to inspire more trust and more confidence in government. He was going to do so by opening up the process of government. He was going to engage people in a direct way. It becomes instrumental because when the Republicans take on Obama's legislative strategy, they're taking on this message as well. And they make, I think, a somewhat cynical but very politically driven strategy that by resisting Obama's initiatives in almost every respect, they not only deny his ability to satisfy his constituents or independents who may have crossed over to vote for him about changing policy, but they also send a message that Obama failed to change Washington. So he defined an objective for himself that's very hard to meet in the context of practical politics. Obama's message was optimistic and intrinsically dialogic. Like much liberal political discourse, and I cite Kenneth Burke here for those of you who either are or will be suffering through Burke this semester with me. Like much liberal discourse, he emphasized seeing an agency. It's a discourse that said, look, your government is broken essentially, but we can use government to repair itself. We can have confidence in governmental institutions. And that is a consistent sort of liberal position that liberals tend to argue this way. He emphasized his confidence in the American people. We were a people of wisdom, ingenuity. We faced past problems. He communicated government had the ability to become workable and to find solutions. And he promised a healthy and vigorous public debate on issues with a transparent policy process. In his declaration of candidacy speech, for instance, at the Illinois State Capitol, he said it was here we learned to disagree without being disagreeable, that it's possible to compromise as long as you know those principles that can never be compromised, and so long as we're willing to listen to each other, we can assume the best in people. These are all very dialogic argumentative concepts embedded right in his campaign. He also emphasized the importance of empathy, which is another concept that's at the cornerstone of dialogic argument. Here in a commencement speech at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, he urged graduates to cultivate a sense of empathy, to put yourself in other people's shoes, to see the world from their eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world. This is a community organizer, right? This is the kind of discourse that one might expect from a person who had led and lived this kind of life. I mention it because I think it's an intrinsic element of who Obama saw himself to be and how he saw his role in government. Now, after Obama handily wins the election, winning states that hadn't fallen to the Democrats in many years and comfortably taking the lead in the Electoral College, I would argue the Republicans had a choice. They could offer alternatives to Obama's policy proposals, but embrace his call for changing the style of Washington. Indeed, if you think about who John McCain has been historically, you would have think that McCain would have been one of the people who would have been calling for precisely that sort of strategy. Or they could challenge the administration on both substance and style through a strategy of pure resistance. I think the debate over health care reveals which strategy the Republicans chose. I want to take a moment here and talk about the role of democracy, role of argument rather in a democracy, and demonstrate that I did make at least some minor feeble attempts to tie some of what I was saying to a theoretical development, something that I don't always do in my work. First to note that citizens engage in arguments in order to resolve controversies. That one of the reasons we need a healthy argumentative public sphere is that people can see what their interests are and can make judgments about how their interests are going to be best served by whatever course of policy action that people will take. They surrender their power to elected officials in doing so. So there's an implicit civic and political commitment of trust that when we send someone off to act legislatively on our behalf, that they'll be somewhat mindful of our interests. And that we create a somewhat transparent deliberative process so that we can keep political parties, lobbyists, special interests, and powerful elites from completely manipulating the system to the detriment of all of us. And of course, given the amount of money that flows into politics right now, this becomes a huge challenge. Democratic governance from this perspective then demands a healthy argumentative ecology. We need a political sphere where people can argue, assess positions, recognize their own interests, and see that those who they send to Washington or to state government will act on their behalf. What are some of the characteristics of democratic argument? Well, I would say first that we understand something about any history of any country or argumentative culture if we study the political arguments as they've unfolded over time on important public issues. So if you look, for instance, at the texture of the civil rights debate in the United States, you would gain real insight into the values of the country, put at stake on an important controversy that really divided people. You can look at public argument as a way to learn the values and the processes of agreement and disagreement in any civil society. Democratic argument, to be effective, assumes that arguers are willing to put their own arguments at risk. If argument is always about the proclamation of my position, but I'm never willing to surrender or to listen or to be engaged in an argumentative process that would coach any kind of respect or appreciation for the other, then clearly we don't have any kind of functioning, deliberative decision-making process. And arguments have to be a rich mix of self-interest, special interest, and the public interest. All of us instinctively know where we stand on an issue, and where we stand is going to be largely determined by where we sit. So if I'm a person with elderly parents, for instance, as I am, I'm going to be very focused on issues of concern to providing assistance to elderly parents. If I'm someone with young school-age children, I'm going to be very focused on what's happening in lower elementary schools. If I'm a farmer, I'm going to focus on agricultural price supports. So special interest or self-interest, these are naturally emerging as the self-interest concerns people. They motivate themselves to join organizations that are going to lobby on their behalf, and they're going to aggressively pursue their own unique interests. Here's the tough one to create in a democracy. Moving people from an awareness of self to an awareness of special, to an awareness of shared public interest, means you have to have that argumentative ecology to coach the appreciation for the shared civic commitment in space. What it is to be linked to people in the deliberating community of interest, where I understand that even though this new proposal might actually not help me, in fact could even cost me a lot of extra money in my taxes, it would still be justified if it could achieve some greater common or shared interest. Thus, the ability to locate a unifying spirit of communal interest is at the center of a democratic political sphere, and one couldn't talk about this without talking about Habermas. Dialogic argument takes certain principles of such argumentative encounters and says that what we need is a process of interaction that's based on people coming together to find issues of mutual concern, and then generating some rules for deliberative or shared discourse that demonstrate their appreciation for the other. So this is going to be rule-governed activity that requires special qualities from participants, and it really requires, and this is our colleague Walt Fisher, this notion of mutual respect. If I don't respect you, if I don't have respect for the quality of your mind or for the values that you hold, then I'm going to argue in a coercive or an unfair, unappreciative way. Wayne Brockreedy once referred to the concept of arguers as lovers, meaning that you really had to have an appreciation for the other. And he contrasted it with an arguer as a rapist or a seducer. A rapist doesn't care about the other. He takes what he wants just to please his own passions or needs at the moment. A seducer will tell you whatever it takes in order to get you to comply with his wishes. But a lover is the noble lover, almost a platonic ideal of respect for the other. Arguers have to be willing to learn from each other, should attempt to agree on shared principles, and this is a critical aspect of democratic decision-making, is a process in which you say, what are we each pursuing? A transparency of declaration of those principles, and then you work to find the shared principles, dialogically comparing until you can produce progress toward a decision. And it requires listening as well as speaking, and again emphasizes empathy. Effective dialogic argument then means that arguers are intent on making a decision. I'm not arguing just to resist progress. I'm attempting to come to some outcome. It requires an evaluation of key principles and the ability to identify your clearly stated claims as you search for agreement. Dialogical argument, by the way, can be heated. It can be unhappy. People can even yell and scream at each other. But it is about an awareness of the relationship in a joint process of sense-making. It's not just about calculating my wins and losses. And so don't assume that just because someone is engaged in a dialogic argument that it's a love fest, or that everybody is setting aside all disagreement. In fact, they're not setting aside disagreement, but they're processing through disagreement with an attempt to make a decision and a focus on the concerns of a common or shared purpose. I think this principle draws very nicely from Dewey's work, where he talks about the importance of preserving democracy as a mode of associated being. If I cease to understand my connection to you, cease to argue in such a way as to respect our shared sense of social purpose, then I've weakened the possibilities for progress in a democracy. Now, the contrast to dialogic argument would be purely strategic argument. This is argument that only cares about producing outcome and emphasizes maximizing one's gains and minimizing losses. So it doesn't have that same sense of awareness of the other, because screw the other, I want to get my way. I am so convinced that what you're advocating would be so contrary to my interests or to my vision of collective interests that I really lose sight of the enterprise as I pursue my strategic objectives. This kind of argument encourages arguers to cling to pre-existing, predetermined positions, and it holds that the evolution of ideas through argument might actually be a sign of weakness. And this is the rhetoric we've increasingly seen in Washington, that those who compromise, those who reach across the aisle, those who potentially change their mind and thus become labeled as flip-floppers, are indeed people who are moving contrary to the principles of strategic argument. This kind of argument undermines the possibility of debate as a creative process of puzzle solving. We see this sometimes in some of the most dramatic issues. For instance, if you go back to the Dole-Clinton race, when the attempt was to reform Social Security, at one point Dole says, we can't argue about Social Security here. We have to take it out of politics and create a special commission, which would then, what, go work in secrecy somewhere, right? Rather than hold a public debate where you engage people in a respectful way to disagree about the progress of Social Security. So, contemporary politics clearly favors the strategic, at least at the moment. Strategic arguers don't put their own positions at risk. They focus on pleasing their core constituency. It lends itself to a focus on self-interest. It means more focus on on the direct effect of your actions and less on the reflexive effects. And by this I mean, if I win, I don't care what the consequences for the health of the public sphere is. I don't care about how I've modeled argument behavior for citizen arguers. I just care that I got my way and I blocked this unhappy proposal, or my campaign contributions continued to matter. It denies the opportunity for people to weave together competing or even incommensurate positions into results less clearly defined as wins or losses. The contemporary media, here's my segue slide. The contemporary media clearly worsens the situation in terms of strategic losses, because people are increasingly turning to news that confirms what they already believe in. So if I'm a Fox or an MSNBC viewer, I'm actually coached to emphasize and appreciate strategic rather than dialogic argument. Social networking sites where I push out information to people who already think like me strongly favor, of course, strategic argument, as does polling and the ability to increasingly fine-tune and search for voters, not with an idea of creating a compelling position at the middle, but instead with the idea of winning 50% plus one. And however I get that one, even if it's not on a shared set of values or interests, doesn't necessarily matter to me. And of course, the competition for audience means an increasing emphasis on conflict frames for news or entertainment frames. And these sources have come to believe that it's much more entertaining when we see people shouting at each other than when we see people coming together to reason. Now, I shift back to Obama and Obama's explicit arguments on health. I'm going to argue that Obama's arguments clearly contain dialogic characteristics of argument and demonstrated his willingness to engage in dialogue. First of all, he clearly stated what the core principle that was underlying the search for healthcare reform was. And that was this notion that healthcare was a right and that providing access to all Americans was indeed a moral issue. This is all drawn, by the way, I look at a lot more data in this study, but I only want to capture a little bit to give you a flavor of it here. This is all drawn from the Obama speech to Congress on September 9th. He said at stake was not just the details of policy, but fundamental principles of social justice and character. He says Americans are a self-reliant people, but here he pleads for the social contract. When fortune turns against one of us, others are there to lend a helping hand. And he says Americans are entitled to a measure of security and fair play, and sometimes government has to step in to deliver that promise. So it's a clearly enunciated declaration of purpose that I would argue is delivered in a dialogic fashion. He calls for calm. He offers to create demonstration projects to test all ideas that are on the table, including Republican proposals. He asked members of Congress to come from both sides to submit ideas and to work together. And he expresses a willingness to consider GOP alternatives, including malpractice reform, as you'll recall. But he says, you know, this is not a path to comprehensive care. So I'm willing to consider it. Certainly that's an issue we can take on, but remember, we're motivated by our goal to pursue this right of health care. And you've got to come to the table with an idea that moves us closer to that right, or this isn't a genuine dialogic attempt, Obama says. Obama, as you may recall, also goes to the extraordinary measure of attending that GOP retreat. And at the GOP retreat, he actually picks up the microphone and doesn't have a speech to them. He literally engages in a questioning and a listening exercise with them. And when they want to break it off, he stays and says, no, I'm having a good time here. Let's continue this process. Thus, I think, trying to really drive the contrast between the dialogic argument strategy and the strategy pursued by the Republicans. He directly challenges the attacks that have been made against him by the opponents to health care reform. And he says, look, I want to continue this dialogue. And he continues, if you look at the transcripts, he over and over uses the term dialogue in this exchange. He promises that he reads all the GOP proposals that come before him and the good ideas we take. You may remember the moment on television when he symbolically acknowledges the congressman from Wisconsin, Paul Ryan, who has really done a lot of pretty hands-on thinking about health care reform. Is one of the few on the Republican side who have ever put forth really concrete proposals. And he invites Ryan to submit them. He has him stand up. He praises him in the midst of the interaction and tries to use it as an opportunity to talk about the explicit characteristics of those proposals. But he does also warn them, and this is a rule-governed statement here. He says, look, I'm willing to engage in conversation. I'm willing to listen to your ideas. I'm willing to be open to all your proposals. But there are rules for dialogue, and you can't insist on winning every point, right? You have to engage in good faith. It can't be all or nothing. Governing requires compromise. And then he explicitly cites this, where he says if a caucus doesn't get 100% or 80%, it's going to be difficult if you're not willing to engage with me. So he's very explicit in his praise for dialogue, in signaling how dialogue can be proceeding, and in setting up the rules by which dialogue will be evaluated. He also held the all-day summit that some of you may remember. Now, several things happen at that summit that make it very unique in the history of presidential discourse. First of all, I would note is it's not held at the White House, it's held at Blair House. And Obama doesn't speak from behind a platform with the seal of the president on it. He seats from a conference table. So he has surrendered a huge amount of authority just by the fact that he, as said, the executive branch is seated at the table with the legislative leadership, and this is an opportunity to make real progress. The conference table setting with Obama as the moderator permits lots of people at the table to have an opportunity to talk. He opens this meeting as well with a call for dialogue and urges participants to use it for real discussion and not just for talking points. And throughout the day's events, he kept saying, where are the points of agreement? And this would be purely dialogic strategy where you focus not so much on the things that are separating or dividing the debate, but on the things that would mark the points where there might be some possibility of making headway. How does the GOP respond? Dialogically? I don't think so. Senator Mitch McConnell declared that the GOP is simply and flatly opposed to the core of the Democratic health care proposal. It's not a dialogic way to begin the argument, right? Categorical no. Only by scraping the whole proposal and starting over could he win Republican support. And he says the core of the bill is $1 trillion government attempt to take over 1/6 of the U.S. economy. So no attempt to engage. It's all or nothing. No right from the beginning. Of course, the threat from the filibuster, where the Democrats don't have the votes to break the filibuster guaranteed to them, becomes the strategy. The party leaders demand opposition to the bill. When the bill is first voted out of the House committee, there is one Republican congressman who votes for it. It's the congressman from Louisiana, Cow, who's elected in William Jefferson's seat. So he's elected in a very Democratic district where clearly this congressman's constituents are going to likely favor and be supportive of a vote in favor of this health bill coming out of committee. But Congressman Cow gets so much opposition from the Republican Party leadership that they guarantee that his funding dries up. So he loses all of his campaign contributions from the Republicans, who of course are who's supplying his contributions, so that he's weak against any opponent and likely to lose. So they're literally willing to give away the seat back to the Democrats to coach party discipline. And similarly, when Olympia Snowe in the Senate votes it out, she's called onto the carpet immediately with threats that they will support someone to run against her from the right the next time. So they demand party discipline and unanimous opposition. And again, I don't think it's an accident. I think the clear message is to deny the claim that you can change Washington. If Washington is still dysfunctional after this debate occurs, in fact, if it looks more dysfunctional, then there's nothing Obama is easily going to do to reframe that situation. And I think that was a naked strategy that was used by the Republican leadership. If you read the Obama victory book again, you'll find elements of that all or nothing play to the base strategy were defining much of Republican consultant advice throughout the election campaign as well. This view understands, by the way, both the impatience and the cynicism of the American people. And it is trading on it. They know that times are difficult. They know that people want things to change very quickly. And they know that Americans are not a people that work slowly over time. But if you look at the history of polling, it's up and down with very dramatic shifts. Most clearly expressed by Minority Leader Boehner, who declared the GOP did not just say no, we said hell no. Nice tan. The GOP, in doing this, fails to clearly state their own argumentative principles. And it's not just that they're dialogic in the strategy of how they refuse to engage in the debate. I would say they don't engage in dialogic argument practices in some other way. They do not concede, for instance, that health care is a right. And they do not say how they would extend coverage to almost 46 million people without health insurance, 16% of the population. But they also do not say when it's okay not to provide assistance, right? We could have had a very specific debate saying, all right, it's not a right, but it is in the interest of government under these conditions to extend a health care guarantee. They never engage in precisely that kind of debate. Instead, they use a vague rhetoric of health care as a responsibility, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, I have an obligation to provide for my family, but if I have a pre-existing condition, how do I fulfill this responsibility? If I lose my job and my benefits don't go with me, how do I meet this responsibility? If I don't have any job at all, how do I assure that government is going to step in to give me that responsibility? I do want to note that there are countries in the world with no health guarantees or protections. In the midst of this healthcare debate, there were stories, for instance, in the New York Times about what happens in the People's Republic of China sometimes to workers on construction sites who are injured when building buildings. And because there isn't a health guarantee or strict laws to guarantee that the workplace would have to provide coverage for you, there are cases that were written in the New York Times of people not being transported to hospitals and being left on the street to suffer because anyone who would take them to the hospital could obligate themselves to have to compensate the physicians or the hospitals for their care. Now clearly, I'm sure that our Republican colleagues wouldn't argue for such a harsh situation to emerge in the United States. There are countries, as I say, where that happens. But if health care is to be rationed, then precisely what is a minimal level of care that we see as a civic commitment? An argument that they would never take on directly, for fear that arguing the specifics of that policy, I think, could create the backlash in the community of core believers. If you follow the implicit assumption that I believe the conservative ethos was making, it would be that housing, food, and education are all rationed in this society on the basis of income, ability to pay, educational opportunities, status, social class, etc. But when you don't say where you think it's appropriate to provide limits to the rationing of health care, then I think you're not engaging in a very helpful or open debate. Instead of engaging in such debate, they engage in a lot of name-calling. Argumentative fallacies, in some sense, for those of you who study that literature. Representative Joe Barton says the president's proposal is a radicalization, and some would say a socialization. I would mention this book again, which is a very interesting portion, if you do read this book, take a look at page 227, where Kensky, Hardy, and Jameson make an explicit argument that coding the language of socialism into the campaign, as they did when Sarah Palin says Obama's a socialist, was intentionally designed to prime race issues. Because socialism is an argument about people's legitimate rights to claim access from government and who pays taxes and who's perceived as not, or is perceived as dependent on welfare. And so, again, I don't think that's an accident. Governor Sarah Palin warned about death panels that would terminate grandma's care. Remember that on her Facebook page. Representative Boehner declared Obamacare, which is an interesting label itself, right? I'm going to call this medical care Obama to saddle my opposition to it as opposition as well to Obama, is a job-killing monstrosity. And Senator Jim DeMint promised to make health care reform Obama's Waterloo. I don't think there's much doubt about strategic framing here. In addition, the GOP activated a whole series of Tea Party protests. Now, I know there are some of you who are saying, now wait a minute, Professor, the Tea Party is independent from the GOP. And maybe there were these people who were opposing health care reform, but that wasn't the GOP's efforts. Indeed, I would argue, well, there was some opposition that wasn't directly organized by the GOP. It would be a mistake not to acknowledge that at the very beginning, the leadership help to organize a lot of those activities was provided by the Freedom Works Foundation, which was headed by former Republican House Majority Leader Dick Armey. So there's a concerted effort to use this opposition in public protest in order to stir up public anxiety about Obama's health care reform and to create even more intense opposition. And you'll see the signs up there are "Nope" and "No Obamacare" and "Don't Socialize the United States" with a hammer and sickle. Tea Party opposition becomes increasingly hysterical as protests are held around the nation. Again, I think these protests are strongly primed and animated by race rhetoric, which is lingering from the campaign, rhetoric about Obama being the outsider, etc. And I would cite that book as well as the Pew studies. And a lot of the literature that I'm going to mention in the second one there, if you follow the Pew studies over the past year, you'll see a lot of data on what the impact of this was. These polls begin to suggest that more people doubt that Obama is a citizen. The recent numbers are incredible, that some 30% almost doubt that Obama is a Christian and continue to believe that he's a Muslim. People begin to express their concern that government actively wants to take away their rights and harm them. And if you look at those Pew study polls, the data now suggests that increasing numbers of people not only don't support the health care reform or don't support the Obama administration, but they've been animated and persuaded by a rhetoric that says their government not only doesn't act in their interest, but may be actively acting against their interests, actively motivated to try to thwart their rights and to take rights away from them and to actually do them harm. And yet the GOP directly aligns themselves with the Tea Party. Governor Palin gives a keynote address at a Tea Party convention and says, I will live, I will die for the people of America, whatever I can do to help. This movement is the future of politics in America. And the ever adept Republican Party head Michael Steele describes the Tea Party as a revelatory movement and says it's important for our party to appreciate and understand that so we can move toward it and embrace it. There is a sense in which I think many in the GOP acknowledged that they had created a monster here. And it's a monster that can come back and bite the hand that so notably fed them and led them. And there are lots of examples of anxiety, even in mainstream Republican thought, that this notion of mobilizing your most extreme supporters has some danger. And of course, we saw that in Senator Bob Bennett's loss when he sought the renomination in the Republican primary in Utah, losing to a Tea Party candidate. Ryan Paul, who wins against McConnell. Rand Paul, excuse me for my typing error there, who loses the McConnell candidate, loses the primary in Kentucky to Paul, who's a very extreme kind of foot and mouth, a little bit dangerous candidate, I think. In Nevada, we get Sharon Angle, who is almost single-handedly made Reid look like he has a chance for another term again. which I think most people wouldn't have thought was possible. And we get the announcement, and the New York Times has made much of this, that the Tea Party is attempting to take over local Republican Party organizations by electing precinct level and the most local level officials in the Republican Party. So if you activate the base in this way, it can create party problems and strategies. But it was, I think, a very shrewd and cynical strategy that doing so still produced more likelihood of gain than loss. What is the consequences of this kind of politics? I think the GOP has said government is so unreliable that thwarting government is an acceptable strategic maneuver. And there is in the GOP mindset such a strong anti-government ethos at the moment that compromise that might strengthen or make government appear more lean, more responsive to problems is perceived as against the GOP strategy. To return for a moment to Kenneth Burke, if Burke said Democrats tend to argue from scene and agency, what's wrong and how do we use government to change it, Republicans tend to argue from purpose and agent. And so morally strong individual agents will be better than institutional reforms of government in order to achieve the purpose, which is to rebuild a society of smaller government. One way I think they have discovered to convince the public they need less government is to exploit the public cynicism and impatience with government at every opportunity. And so it's a deliberate strategy that if I run my campaigns against big government, I talk about the importance of an independent insight, then anything I do that weakens government seems in furtherance of that strategy. And of course, this only serves to deepen public cynicism, discourage voter participation, and increase feelings of political alienation. But it doesn't matter that if I discourage some voters, if I still get 1% or one more vote than you do. And polling again confirms that this is the effect of the strategy and that the strategy is indeed working. And just go to the Pew poll sites. I didn't pull out numbers, but there's a constant movement of decreased support for Obama and of decreased confidence and support for government. There was an uptick in support for government immediately after Obama's election, and it's been going back down pretty consistently ever since. The strategy, of course, has consequence, and as the healthcare debate unfolded, we saw some of those darker and more unpleasant consequences. First of all, there were actual death threats, and threats to the safety of members of Congress who voted for the health reform bill. There was one incident where we had a series of Republican congressmen standing outside the Capitol building, egging on protesters who were yelling, violent acts against people who were going to vote for this bill. So I think that's one very negative consequence. I would also cite the Southern Poverty Law Center report from the end of the debate earlier this year that said there had been a 244% increase in anti-government patriot groups from 2008 to 2009. And that's pretty significant in and of itself. Now, historically, of course, these kinds of groups have always become more active when we're in the midst of an economic recession or a very deep downturn. There's always been a certain amount of anti-immigrant bashing, which is part of the history of this country, unfortunately. But I think that we see such a marked increase in so short a time tells us something about the political and social consequences of this kind of discourse. And I would also add that militias, which are sort of the scariest set of these groups, and this isn't your basic granny with a Tea Party sign wearing a funny Statue of Liberty hat, but these are people who are actually willing to arm themselves and become survivalists and join things like the Michigan militia movement, etc. The number of groups grew from 42 to 127 in 2009. So again, I think it's a measure of the kind of consequences of this kind of discourse that would begin to move against the interests of the state. I would argue that even though the Tea Party, average Tea Party member isn't dangerous, these militia people can be dangerous. I mean, we live in a culture where people have a lot of guns, or fertilizer bombs in this case. And if you animate people with the notion that their government is actually working against their interests, is actually out deliberately trying to diminish their health and welfare and take away their rights, then it shouldn't surprise you that some true patriot and martyr type leaders are going to step forward and plot some pretty terrible things. And of course, that's the Oklahoma City Federal Building and Mr. McVeigh in his very fetching mugshot. So I want to conclude this, and I promised time for you to talk, and I've given you plenty, with the observation that says, first of all, in a democracy, civic virtue matters. And I think what should most concern all of us, whether you like the Democrats or like the Republicans, is that we elect people and try to preserve a political system that is based on a set of civic virtue, a set of shared social political values that affirm the principles for which the country really wants to stand. Those who go to Washington take the following oath, and I would argue that that notion of supporting and defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, really obligates them to preserve not just the letter of the law, but the constitutional principles that the Founding Fathers were moved by as they shaped us into a deliberating political community. This obligates congressmen, in short, not just to pursue their strategic interests or their narrow self-interest objectives, but to also remember Dewey's notion of democracy requiring arguments that preserve our ways of associated being. They have an obligation to work to solve problems, and even if they can't agree on common solutions, to do so in a respectful way that honors and values the other. And I think it's a great danger to us when they don't. Those who profess to love their country, in short, should be asked a higher test than do they wear a flag pin on their lapel, or do they stand when the Pledge of Allegiance is said. They really have to demonstrate by their behavior and their conduct in the course of their office that they respect us as a deliberated people. And when they don't, then I think their fellow citizens and, of course, the media needs to call them out on it. And I think the media did a terrible job of covering the health care reform debate. I think they were completely taken over by the spectacle of the disagreement and the flash and drama and pictures of the screaming Tea Party protesters, and just did an awful job of giving people a faithful account of what was in that bill or what was about that process. And there's just a brand new poll that I just saw yesterday that suggests that people do not understand what was in that health care bill. It's a complicated bill, and most people express an opinion of the bill without being able to give any detail to the content of the bill and to whether or not it helps them or doesn't help them. The most noteworthy statement being evidenced, I think, by the ad that Carly Fiorina is running against Barbara Boxer on TVs this week, which is attacking Boxer for cutting her Medicare benefit, when in fact the Medicare benefits that are referred to are part of the revised health care debate. So she's cutting from one program in order to find the funds to build the much more ambitious health care proposal. But it's not what the public understands, and clearly the pollsters working for the Fiorina campaign have identified that, and thus are feeding even more cynicism with those kind of messages. Questions, rebuttals? Larry?
When you began sort of you're laying out sort of Obama's strategy and then focused particularly on the Republicans for not responding dialogically, it seems to me that's somewhat misleading in that Obama, arguably, was equally non-dialogic in excluding from the debate as much as possible anything you might say to his left. The strategy administration explicitly said single payer is off the table. They were excluded from forums, they were excluded from debates. In fact, when Obama said to Congress, if anybody has any better ideas, we want to hear it, Margaret Flowers, who's a physician and a member of Physicians for a National Health Plan, showed up at an Obama event in Baltimore, which I think was been referring to, and said, we've got a better idea. Here's the documentation. I'd like to present it to the president, and she was arrested for attempting to present this to the president, despite the fact he said we want to hear it. So it seems to me that, A, that was non-dialogic in many of the ways that you're saying, which is to say, it said all of these proposals, which I think we all know are commonplace in other parts of the world, in fact, taken for granted in most of our peer democracies, are off the table. But even more strategically, they allowed the Obama position to be defined as the extreme left of the debate, when it's actually a fairly middle position. And then they argued from the middle to the right, whereas if they had opened the debate fully, then Obama's position might have been more effectively presented as the middle position it is, rather than being defined as extreme, which it certainly isn't. So I think it's a failure strategically, and I think morally in the terms that you outlined. I think it was a failure of this proclaimed dialogic approach.
Yeah, I agree with part of that. I don't agree with all of that. I think that the Obama administration made a political calculus early on, and this is the part that I think is consistent with the primary claim you're making, that they wanted to win some Republican support for this, and that they understood they weren't going to win any Republican support for a single payer. Now, did they close off that debate too early to try to make headway, or was it instead a reading of the tea leaves to say, this debate, if we're going to make genuine progress toward our political objectives, has to demonstrate that we're reaching out to hear the arguments of the other side? And I think it was more that rather than a failure to have engaged in a dialogic process with the left. Now, was that strategic choice a mistake? Arguably. I think had they fully understood or appreciated the degree to which the Republicans were going to demand complete discipline and be sufficiently cynical as to foreclose legislation, even when it became apparent that the legislation they were opposing was consistent with legislation they had previously favored, they would probably use a different strategy. Because then it would have been a strategy to set aside the goal of dialogue and participate more in pragmatic, hard, knockdown, drag-out politics. I think if anything, he was trying maybe too hard to be dialogic, and he was trying to make progress. And so he said, look, these arguments aren't going to move us closer to our goal, and that's why he foreclosed that debate. But that's my sense. Lynn?
Looking forward, given what happened in your estimation, what would be the strategy to replace this? Because obviously the strategy doesn't seem to have been particularly effective.
Well, I mean, the real problem that we face now is that we have an increasingly uninformed electorate, right? Who are increasingly siloed in terms of where they're getting information. And it's very difficult to create a conversation that cuts across those community of hearers. So I think that the first thing we need is we need media leaders, we need civic leaders, we need academic leaders who will be more willing to call people out when they conduct themselves in such a way that are contrary to the public interest. So that the story becomes a story about the tactics and about the debate, and not just a story about the political objectives. I think that's one thing that has to happen. I think the second thing that has to happen is we have to react with alarm to what's happening to money in politics. Because increasingly the debate is being shaped by people who can control campaign contributions and purchase vast amounts of time. And so you get these huge distortions of message that are occurring because of money moving into politics. So we're not going to change the tenor of the debate if we don't change media practice, if we don't make people demand a higher standard of accountability from elected officials, and if we don't do something about the flow of money into politics. All very difficult problems. But I think you don't wrestle around the edges. You've got to take on those big problems. Bob?
Yeah, I think this last point indicates the problem. I mean, if you have a lot of money, you can appear very reasonable. It's usually when you don't have money and you're not being heard, you seem kind of wild and out there. And if you think of the basic economic debate, the banks, the people they could hire, the PR people, we actually teach PR, I'm not quite sure why, but they could buy the most articulate people. They always seem reasonable. They've gone to the best schools. They're the best and the brightest. And they basically sold an irrational position, say on financial deregulation, as rational. They never raised their voices, right? They never seemed angry. They seemed accommodating. And I would agree with what Larry was saying. I don't think there was anything reasonable about the health care plan. I really don't. In its main construction. And I think people have a right to take issue with it. I think, I give it a B- or something, I would vote for it. But basically, it's a program like the Massachusetts plan, which does not cover or control costs. It forces people to sign on. It has some real defects, yet it's presented as reasonable. Now, if we lived in the society of the founders, where we have a penny press, we don't have the role of money, and so forth, then your argument is unassailable. In that village society, rural democracy, yes, open yourself up to the opponent. Yes, listen to the argument. And one cannot question that. It seems to me we face a much bigger problem, which is that reasonableness poses as reason. And if you think of the nightmares that we've been through, whether it's lying about the Iraq War, or you think about the radical deregulation, and so forth, basically, and here I'll end by saying, the reason I was motivated to, I actually wrote a column defending Rand Paul. And I think there's something about the libertarian position that he espouses that cuts through. And he said, come on, we don't know what the Fed does. And his father has put a bill in asking for an audit. It seems to me very reasonable. The candidate who won in Alaska, the Tea Party person, right, was saying something I think is quite reasonable. Why did we spend the TARP money? Why did we bail out Goldman Sachs and Chase? And a lot of the Tea Party anger is about the bailout, which again was presented as very reasonable. It makes perfect sense to put trillions of dollars in with the banks at a time when we do nothing to help people stay in their homes and have a moratorium on foreclosures. So I would argue there's a danger in your approach.
I don't think there's any doubt, but that the argument literature presupposes a kind of a commitment to a rational process and a respectful deliberation that is absolutely in short supply. But I would argue that historically we can find moments in the United States, and you don't have to go that far back, when indeed Congress acted with that sort of responsibility. And that furthermore you can find many European parliaments, even in politically complex societies with difficult issues and similar sets of problems, including fractured media systems, etc., are able to conduct themselves with a level of civic debate that meets this kind of set of objectives. And so to simply say, oh, we can't do that anymore, I think that's where the cynicism sets in. And I don't have a problem with Rand Paul raising the arguments or with Tea Party activists raising the arguments. I want to see more political engagement, not less. But I also want to see a kind of engagement that values a careful exploration of the alternative positions. And your position on the TARP funds, which I don't, because it wasn't really the focus of what I was doing here, need to debate you. There's some pretty good answers to those arguments about the liquidity crisis and what happens if suddenly we have a complete run on the banks, which I think there was a huge anxiety we were going to have if there wasn't the gesture by the government to take those reform actions. And so the fact that one can disagree with them and find some very reasonable, credible positions, I think is terrific. But I wouldn't present the opposition as the statement that says, well, look, the emperor has no clothes either. I think that would be a mistake. And I don't know that that gets even close to answering your question, but...
Can I just make one point?
One.
This is the way it always runs. You're assuming, yes, there's this sort of center of logic and so forth. What Ron Paul, and I'm not the great libertarian advocate here, Ron Paul actually has a majority to support a bill, right, that's going to cause an audit of the Fed. The fact is, and this was the point made in the last election, it was made by the Tea Party people, it's a valid point. When that money was dispersed, it was done in secret meetings at the Fed, late at night, the bankers were there, the public was not there, the press was not there. Our money was taken from us, given to these people. Now, maybe you can make a plausible argument that was a good thing. It was not part of a public debate. We were never consulted, and we were never given the basic facts. That was true about the decision to go to war in Iraq. It's been true about every major public policy decision we have faced, certainly in the last 30 years. And so to present the view that somehow people who deny the rest of us the basic information are being reasonable because they don't raise their voices and they don't carry sides.
I don't think that's what I said. I mean, I don't think that was even close to what I said. But
Why is Randy Paul dangerous?
I'm gonna.
You said he's dangerous. Why is he dangerous?
No, I didn't say he was dangerous. First of all, if I go back to that slide, I did not say the Tea Party activists are dangerous. I said a kind of rhetoric that is encouraged that demonizes the president as Hitler is profoundly dangerous. And I think I drew a careful distinction that I don't think that Engel is dangerous. I don't think Paul is dangerous. I don't think most grannies that are carrying their signs are dangerous. I think it's the people who perceive these threats and they want to step forward as martyrs themselves who can become dangerous. Okay, can I get Joseph first, because he's been very patient there.
I want, along the same lines, how do you have a dialogic argument in this culture of secrecy when you said one of the cornerstones is transparency? And it seemed like early on the administration was focused on this transparency with the healthcare debate, but then deals were made with the healthcare companies or with the drug companies that were not open for anyone, and it was, the bill was supposed to be posted online for a certain amount of time, which it wasn't. So, you know, he said that he was going to be transparent, but he wasn't. So how doesn't that weaken his dialogue?
Very, very good question, Joseph. But one of the challenges, and it goes also to the point that Bob is making, is creating transparency, of course, is very, very difficult. And I think there was a sincere attempt at transparency early in the process. And there was a commitment to public hearings and public dialogue, but those dialogues became largely a sideshow for activist protests of people getting up and yelling. And I think as they unfolded, it is absolutely a fair criticism to say the administration backed away from some of that commitment to transparency. I also think with regard to the TARP money being dealt out, one of the challenges with the example that Bob gives there is that everyone knew that the psychology of the investor community in the market was going to be influenced if everything is transparent. And so managing transparency when you're also managing investors and managing a Wall Street community becomes one of the huge challenges of contemporary governance. And so, you know, part of what we're talking about is an idealized process, and it's an idealized process that aims towards some shared goals and progress. It clearly doesn't result in a perfect condition of a perfect state, just as I think no one would consider Habermas's ideal speech situation to really exist somewhere in a small village in Germany. Now I had, yes, please.
You seem to suggest that technology necessary, and I'm rephrasing it correctly, but you seem to suggest that technology does lead to some kind of polarization.
Social
TV,
networking?
Yeah, social networking. I wonder, is it sort of a consensus result, or is it, so that's the first question. Second question is, do you think that it has to be this way, or technology can be designed in a different way that actually facilitates civil discussions and deliberations?
Well, certainly there are some people who are reading more broadly as a result of new technology. There are some people who are exposed to a much wider array of material and sources than others. But the one thing that hasn't changed for most of us is our time. And so we're exposed to more information, but because we're barraged with so much of it, we have less time to process it. And so I think there's pretty good data to suggest more and more people are reading more and more narrowly. They're reading within sites that confirm what they already believe. It's much easier to convince you to believe what you already know than to convince you to believe something else. And there's just lots and lots of data on the influence of networked communication in that regard. Over several years. I mean, if you want to look at a very fine book that explicitly makes this argument, I would do Phil Howard's book on the effect of new communication technology in the public sphere. It's about 4 years old now, but he makes very good sort of theoretical arguments that are supported by a lot of data that we now see. And you know, I'd refer again to the Pew studies and to the press studies by what's it called? The people in the press, state of the press, state of the news. And they've done a whole series of studies on what people read, what Republicans read, what Democrats read, how their readership habits have changed in the new media environment, including a lot of the networking studies. Facebook, and when I push out information to people who already think like me. Jeff?
3 quick points on strategic versus dialogic. One, I actually think it's an interesting question whether some of the Tea Party winners, which is specifically Rand Paul and Joe Miller, if he is a winner, might in fact be more dialogic. That is, they're ideological, but I'm not sure they're strategic in the sense you're talking about. They believe in what they're saying, you might disagree with them, but I think they may be more intellectually honest at this stage in their careers. Second question is, why did Obama think that Washington would operate on a dialogic instead? I would, in terms of your study, ask the question of whether it's what he believed, but also what strategically made sense in his fight against Hillary Clinton, because she was taking a different position. She, although she's worked with Republicans all the time, said, you got to take Washington one way. He was saying, I'm going to create a different kind of Washington. Anyway, it's a second thought. And the third question is it really fair to say that when Obama said we have to start with the principle that healthcare is a right, that he was taking a dialogic position, or by saying that healthcare is a right as an opening point in debate, we can disagree about how we achieve that right, but it's a right. Wasn't he laying down a position that really didn't allow for any much compromise?
Well, let me take the last one first. It's not a violation of dialogue to start with a declared first principle. In fact, that's usually the clearest path to dialogue, is to say, look, here's the core belief that I'm advancing, and then you get the other side to do that, and then you start from there to engage. On the second question of what made him think Washington could be this way, first of all, he's not the only Democrat who's approached office with so much confidence in government and political institutions that they can be accused of taking a naive or Pollyannish view of what can be achieved. Second, I would submit his work as a community organizer, maybe his life story, which genuinely said, my accomplishments are a demonstration of the progress that America can make in a short amount of time. And finally, his work as a constitutional law professor, where he seemed, and for this I would take the people who know him and worked with him and taught with him or were students of his who say, he's pretty much what you see. He listens. He asks questions. He doesn't have a big sense of humor, by the way, apparently, when he's in argument. He can be quite, willing to just be a taskmaster and have trouble with distractions that would pull him away. But I think it's who he is. I mean, I think it's his identity would be that. Now, on the first question, the problem with seeing somebody like Paul might use a dialogic style, but if I'm completely committed to a libertarian philosophy, it's pretty hard to be dialogic about dictating from a philosophy that is that absolutist in its grounding. So now I cross back over my other position and say, at some point you have to put your own arguments at risk. And so if I'm such a true believer, I won't put my arguments at risk, then I'm not dialogic. Even if I'm willing to take on new fights or embrace new ways of thinking. Dimitri, I think you'll have to be the last one. I'm sorry.
So you mentioned the role of money and the role of the press. I want to throw in a third kind of structural force, which is the way that districts have been sliced and diced to make
huge problem, more especially for Congress.
Right, so this makes for more extreme points of view.
Absolutely.
When taken together, all three of those things are structural forces. They aren't really interpersonal forces or things that are subject to moral choice. And so your last 2 points are basically, shouldn't we all be better behaved and shouldn't we call these people to account? I kind of wonder if that's not really realistic, because this is really the product of a system, and if you wanted to change those behaviors, you need to change the system. Otherwise, it's predictable. It's like saying, it really bothers me that these ambulance chasing lawyers are out there behaving so badly. Well, there are laws and there are structures that make that incentivized. And likewise, we've created incentives to make people behave these ways. So calling on their better parts of their behavior, as many liberals do, always strikes me to be a recipe for losing.
No, I agree with that to a point, and I strongly agree with the claim about the way the legislative districts are crafted. But of course, that only affects House. That doesn't affect the Senate, where you still have to win a political community in the entire state. The reason I wouldn't be dismissive of the other, though, is that I think the cynicism feeds the strategic way of framing to say whatever I do to win matters, because the other side is so evil that if they win, they'll do this damage. And so I am justified in taking any action I want to take, if their victory would be so damaging to the America that I believe, or in my sense.
Inevitable given the system.
Well, it's very much, it's systemically connected, that the flow of money into politics and the flow of special interests and the negativity of media and the inattentive citizens, right?
Well, and therefore to fix it, it's not calling on people's better judgment, but to find ways to change the policies that made those systems possible.
Yeah, although we start by changing some media habits, right? So that media doesn't get away with delivering this as the news story. And that may be changing the media economic structures so that they're not so relentlessly focused on audience and entertainment, you know, beer and circuses. I mean, there may be lots of solutions we can approach to change some media habits. But clearly a lot of the story about a complex debate like this originates with how the press failed to fulfill its role. But it's ordinary citizens, you know, if we don't show an interest, if we don't pay attention, if we don't log in and look at the news, then we're going to operate out of ignorance and be very susceptible to the 30-second commercials and the attack speech. And I'm out of time.
Structurally cut off that.
Okay, thanks.